Good morning, year term. So, we're going to carry on now with an entirely new topic. That is the hormones topic, which is completed. It's all done now. Moving on to something a little bit more applied with some ecology. Ecology is the study of basically the way living beings interact with each other. So, we're talking about a much larger scale. With the hormones topic, we were talking about small chemicals that were happening inside of your body. And for some people, that would have been fascinating and been something they were really interested in. For other people, they're more interested in things like food chains, ecosystems, and that's what we're going to do now, pretty much for the rest of the year. There's some really nice practicals to do in there in the summer, and there's a lot to look forward to with this. We're going to start off with some really, really simple food chain materials. So, first questions here are from the hormones topic. The third one there is more to get you think about this thing. What is a food web? Because we haven't touched on much of this since year 7. Well, some of it's very easy, some of it's definitely not. So pause me and make sure you've got the answers to these questions. I'd like them written down, just the answers, not the questions, at the top of your work for which you're going to hand in. Right, so what does ethene do for plants? It causes fruit to ripen, is the answer to that question. How does a dialysis machine work? A dialysis machine works by taking the blood out of the patient, by running it through a dialysis machine with dialysis fluid or dialysate in it. Dialysis fluid has the correct concentrations of various chemicals inside of it, particularly things like urea. It has no urea in it, so that the chemicals will move out of the blood by diffusion. What is a food web? We're going to come on to that in a second, so I'm going to answer that one right now. Hopefully you've got an idea of that, and you're going to check your idea against the correct definition, if you like, in about 5 or 6 slides' time. So, let's get started. So, first things first, in order to survive, you have to transfer energy to your cells. Now, for animals, that will involve eating plants or other animals. For plants, obviously, they can do photosynthesis. For animals, that is not an option. Now, some of the animals you eat obviously have to have eaten other animals in order to survive. And we're going to learn very briefly how to organize that information into food chains and food webs. Now, I don't anticipate this first lesson being particularly difficult for you. Please do work through it carefully because there are a few new terms you may not have used before. So, first thing is, what's a food chain? I'm sure immediately in your head you have an idea of what a food chain is. I would hope that will be the case. So, the food chain is a diagram that shows what an organism eats, and more accurately, it shows the transfer of energy between organisms. So, from year 7, can you have a go at drawing me a food chain of these organisms? How would you go about doing that? And pause me while you do it, obviously. So, hopefully you drew something that looked a bit like this. Now, there we go. It doesn't have to be this exact one. You can substitute in a food fish and insect. However, as long as you've got this general idea. Now, the key points are this. The first organism has to be a producer. I'd like to label the producer on your food chain. In this case, we know what the producer is. It's the pondweed. Energy is transferred from the sun to that organism. Now, I know I'm reading this slide, but they are extraordinarily important points. So you've got the idea that the sun has to move energy from itself into this organism, usually a plant. It's not always strictly true. There are some organisms that do something called chemosynthesis. Chemosynthesis is taking other chemicals and using them to create glucose for themselves. Now, an example would be organisms living in the deep, deep ocean on, for instance, volcanic vents. The sun doesn't reach that far, so they're not doing photosynthesis, they're doing chemosynthesis. But every organism you're going to come across as a producer is going to be doing photosynthesis, taking its energy from the sun. The second organism is usually a herbivore. Now it can be an omnivore, but we're going to lead with herbivore for now. And the third organism has to be a carnivore, and from then on every organism will be a carnivore. Now the key thing people get wrong here is the arrows. There are still people in year 10 who draw the arrows going from the insect larvae to the pondweed, as if some poor insect larva is crawling over the pondweed and the pondweed snaps it up. It's showing the energy moving from one organism to another organism. Energy transfer. Energy is not transferred from the fish into the insect. It's transferred from the insect into the fish. And I promise there'll be at least one person who still draws it the wrong way round. You've got to think about it. If it helps, think about yourself eating a burger. You bring the burger into you, you do not bring yourself into the burger. If you were drawing a diagram on a piece of paper of someone eating a burger, a how-to, you would draw an arrow with the burger going into the mouth. You would not draw an arrow from the mouth into the burger, sort of thing. Right? So, please, I'm labouring this point because there's still people who do it. Please draw the arrows the correct way round. Fine. Now, just to make sure you've got that, spend 30 seconds on this. Can you read that and draw me a food chain, please? So hopefully you haven't struggled with that too much. It should look like that. Now it's just that simple, it's just that straightforward. Acacia tree to giraffe to lion. Fine. So we're going to learn some more terms here. Most of these were used in year 7, there's a couple we're going to add on. As I say, this is not a particularly complicated first lesson. So first things first, producers. Very straightforward, we've already talked about that. You can write that down, that's fine. Primary consumer, we have to be able to use effectively. So you have to understand what a primary consumer is. Secondary consumer is just an organism which eats a primary consumer, and a tertiary consumer is just an organism which uses a secondary consumer. And I don't think there's any need to write that down particularly. The one you'll be asked about is producer as a definition, the others you'll never be asked about. But you could be asked to label a food chain. So what I'd like you to do is to label that giraffe food chain with the correct terms here. So make sure it's labelled with producer, primary, secondary or tertiary consumer, whatever you think is appropriate. Again, hopefully not difficult, and make sure you got it. Fine. So hopefully everybody put that the acacia tree was the producer, the giraffe was a primary consumer, and the lion was a secondary consumer. Fine. Now, there's one more thing to add on here. Again, not too difficult. This is trophic levels. This is actually the thing you're most likely to be asked about when labelling a food chain. You're most likely, to be asked to label the trophic levels that different organisms are found at. So here's a general idea. Don't write this one down, but you have to understand that the first trophic level is at the bottom. So the first trophic level is your producer, and then it then works up from there. The second trophic level is the same thing as the primary consumer. The third trophic level is the same thing as the secondary consumer, and so on. The only issue people have here is because they know that primary means 1, they try and make primary consumer the first trophic level, and they make up a 0th trophic level for the plants. Unfortunately, they don't match up. The second trophic level is the primary consumer. It just goes from 1 upwards. There's no difficulty here. Fine. So what I'd like you to do then, to kind of have got to this and to be able to move on from food chains, and I don't think there'll be any difficulty here, do this task. This will take you 2 or 3 minutes, I should imagine. Make sure it's labelled correctly. I'm going to go through it together. So I will give you, 2 or 3 minutes, just pause me. Right, so hopefully everybody put either a grass or the tree first. followed by a herbivore, either the gazelle, the buffalo, or the giraffe, followed by a carnivore, either the hyena or the lion. And if you like, you could probably put the lion after the hyena, because on certain occasions the lion will eat hyena. Now, it's worth noting we're talking about general interactions here. Yes, sometimes, for instance, the classic question I asked is, what about cannibalism? Sometimes lions will eat each other. Sometimes, maybe. But generally, their general food source is not other lions. That's not their main food source. So no, you wouldn't draw a little curly arrow going back into lion again. Just because once upon a time, a hyena ate a lion, doesn't mean you have to have an arrow going one way and then an arrow going the other way. Because generally, lions can eat hyenas. Hyenas generally do not eat lions. And so, we're talking about general ideas. If it's happened once in history, it doesn't mean you have to have a line for it, an arrow for it. You should have an arrow going from the plant to the herbivore, towards the herbivore, and then from the herbivore towards the carnivore. And then labelling, well, the primary consumer should be whatever is eating your plant, either buffalo, gazelle, or giraffe. Secondary consumer should be whatever is eating your primary consumer, probably a hyena or lion. Producer should be the grass or the tree. The herbivore should be whatever is eating the grass or the tree, the same as the primary consumer. The carnivore should be anything where the hyena or lion is present. Trophic level 1 should be the plant. Trophic level 2 should be whatever is eating the plant. And trophic level 3 should be whatever is eating trophic level 2. What do the arrows in your food chain represent? They represent the transfer of energy. They do not, and this is important, represent what eats what. It's not a good enough definition. It's technically true, of course it's technically true, but on the GCSE exam curriculum, the answer will be the transfer of energy between organisms. So you've got to write that. That's what you've got to write. Hopefully that's clear. That's food chains, and that's kind of so far so ridiculously easy. Now, food webs, a little bit more complex, but not ridiculously. Obviously, most organisms eat more than one other type of organism. Most, though not all, herbivores eat more than one type of plant. Most carnivores eat more than one type of herbivore. That's a general rule. Not always true, but generally. Now, you can show this as a food web, and a food web is a set of linked food chains. They show the feeding relationship of organisms in a way that is more realistic, i.e., a food chain would indicate that, for instance, we'll go back to our original food chain way back before, that giraffes only eat acacia trees, and lions only eat giraffes. That is definitively not true. So what we're seeing is a more realistic way of laying out this information. Now, it's also a much less useful way of laying out the information in general. Now, there's 3 questions here, and this is the kind of things you will see for this food web. You won't generally be asked to draw a food web. You'd be much more likely to be asked to do one of these 3 questions. So what I'd like to do is just answer these 3 questions in your books. So have a go at these, hopefully not too difficult. So, the difference between a food chain and a food web is a food web is more realistic in the way that it handles the information, and it is this collected set of food chains, whereas a food chain only shows one feeding relationship, food web shows lots of feeding relationships. Anything along those lines. 2 food chains from this food web, well, there's a few. You want to go for the longest one possible, I suppose. Algae, small invertebrates, blue reel, great white shark, algae, zooplankton, clownfish, great white shark, anything along those lines. But algae, sea turtle, great white shark will do fine. If you're asked to draw a food chain, make sure you include all possible organisms. So if you just wrote algae, sea turtle, that's not a food chain. This doesn't show accurately any feeding relationship. You need to include the great white shark. So every single one of your food chains should include algae at the bottom and great white shark at the top. Classic mistake, they like to lay it out like this, so what the primary consumer is just below the producer. Everyone reads that as zooplankton, algae, small invertebrate, blue regal, great white shark. So if you wrote zooplankton first for either of your food chains, be careful and watch where the arrows are going. You'll notice that the algae is the only organism from which arrows are coming out and not going in. So that must be the producer. What happened to the population of sea turtles if clownfish died out, and why? Well, there are two options here. Let's say the clownfish died out tomorrow. If the clownfish died out, maybe there might be more algae because the clownfish eat algae. If there are more algae, there might be more sea turtles. So the sea turtles might go up because they have more food. But if the clownfish die out, there might also be a lot more zooplankton which might eat all the algae. So there might not be any food, so the sea turtles might go down. Also, if the clownfish die out, the great white sharks will have less food, so maybe they hunt down more sea turtles. So maybe the sea turtles are wiped out by the great white sharks, so maybe they go down. And you can see, excuse me, I apologise. You can see there's even more weird examples, like maybe if the clownfish die out, there'll be less food for the great white sharks, so they might eat all the blue regals. If the blue regals are all eaten, then there might be more small invertebrates, so there might be less algae, so there might be less sea turtles. Now this is important that we understand. The reason food webs tend to be less useful but a lot more realistic is because you can see when you mess with a food chain, it's very clear what's going to happen for your food chain. When you mess with a food web, it becomes a lot more complicated what's going to happen. And that complicates matters. It makes matters a lot more realistic. It's very true to say that if you remove an organism, or even dramatically reduce its numbers, that it will massively change every other organism in the food web. But it's a lot more easy to quantify if it's laid out in a food chain. And I hope everyone spotted that was Finding Nemo. My classic example. Fine. Now, I'm going to skip through this one, gentlemen. We're going to come to that at a different point in time. Now, I think, to be honest, once you've done that, I'm happy to be done. There's very few exam questions just on food chains and food webs, so we're not going to dwell on that for very much time. So we're going to leave it entirely for now. When we come on to our next lesson, which is pyramids of biomass, and is enormously more difficult and complex, we will do some exam questions which include both food chains and pyramids of biomass. They go together, that's why I do them together. Very rare you'll see an exam question just on food chains, just because it's so easy. But we will do some exam questions next lesson. So what I need you to understand is how a food chain works, to be able to draw a food chain accurately, how a food web works, and to be able to analyse a food web accurately. Hopefully that's all very clear to you. It's not difficult at this point. More difficult next lesson, so please come back and make sure you do that one properly. Have a very good day.